King David stands on his high balcony, gazing over the sprawling city of Jerusalem. The air is warm, heavy, with a scent of blooming jasmine and distant smoke. Below, the kingdom thrives, unaware of the king's restless, wandering eyes. He watches the soldiers depart for war, their armor glinting in the harsh sun. David remains behind, his crown resting heavily upon his brow. His gaze drifts across the rooftops, landing on a private courtyard nearby. A woman stands there, bathing in the cool, shimmering water of a basin. Bathsheba moves with a grace that stops the king's breath. David leans forward, his hands gripping the cold stone railing tightly. The beauty of the scene consumes his thoughts, drowning out his royal duties. He calls for his most trusted servant with a low, urgent command. The servant bows, listening intently to the king's illicit instructions. Under the cover of twilight, Bathsheba is brought to the palace chambers. The heavy wooden doors close, sealing them away from the world's judgment. Shadows dance on the walls as the affair unfolds in secret. Weeks pass, and the weight of the secret begins to manifest. Bathsheba sends word to the palace, she is with child. Panic flickers in David's eyes, threatening his carefully crafted reputation. He paces his room, the floorboards creaking under his frantic weight. He must act quickly to bury the truth beneath a lie. A messenger is dispatched to the front lines to summon Uriah. Days later, Uriah arrives, dusty and weary from the brutal siege. David greets him with false warmth, offering wine and royal favor. He encourages Uriah to return home to his wife for the night. Uriah bows, but his expression remains stoic and deeply loyal. He refuses to enjoy the comforts of home while his brothers suffer. Uriah sleeps on the palace threshold, guarding the king's door instead. David watches from the shadows, his frustration boiling into cold rage. The king tries again, plying the soldier with more wine. Still, Uriah remains steadfast, his integrity a mirror to David's corruption. David realizes his plan to mask the pregnancy has failed completely. Desperation turns into a dark, calculated resolve within the king. He sits at his desk, quill scratching parchment with trembling hands. The letter he writes is a death warrant for his loyal soldier. He seals the scroll with the royal signet ring, pressing hard. Uriah is summoned once more to receive his orders. He takes the scroll, unaware it contains his own execution. David watches him leave, his face a mask of hollow indifference. Uriah rides back toward the front, the scroll tucked into his tunic. The battlefield is a landscape of mud, blood, and iron. Uriah delivers the king's message to the commanding general. The general reads the orders and looks at Uriah with pity. The command is clear. Place Uriah in the thickest part of the fight. Then, the soldiers must retreat, leaving him to face the enemy alone. The next morning, the trumpets sound for a desperate assault. Uriah charges forward, his sword raised high against the encroaching tide. His comrades pull back as instructed, abandoning their brother in arms. Arrows rain down like black needles from the sky. Uriah falls, his lifeblood soaking into the thirsty, broken earth. The battle rages on, but the king's secret is now buried deep. Back in the palace, David receives the news of the victory. He nods solemnly, pretending to mourn the loss of a brave man. He believes he has secured his throne and his reputation forever. But the silence of the palace is heavy with unseen judgment. David stares into the distance, his soul beginning to fracture. The price of his desire has been paid in innocent blood. He walks to the window, looking out over the silent city. A storm gathers on the horizon, dark and ominous. The king is alone, trapped by the walls he built himself. His reign of prosperity has ended. The era of shadows begins. David sits upon his throne, the weight of his secret pressing heavily against his chest. The palace halls feel cold, echoing with the silence of his hidden, dark betrayal. Nathan the prophet enters the throne room, his expression stern and filled with divine purpose. David looks up, sensing the gravity of the prophet's unexpected and uninvited arrival. Nathan begins to speak, his voice steady as he tells a parable of a stolen lamb. He describes a rich man who took the only beloved possession of a poor neighbor. David's face reddens with righteous indignation, his fist clenching against the arm of his throne. The king shouts that the man who did this deserves to die for his cruelty. Nathan steps forward, his eyes piercing through the king's facade of royal authority. The prophet points a finger, declaring firmly, "You are the man who has done this." David freezes, the color draining from his face as the truth hits him like stone. The king collapses back into his seat, his defenses crumbling under the weight of guilt. He confesses his sin before God, his voice trembling with genuine, deep-seated remorse. Nathan warns that the sword will never depart from his house because of this act. The prophet departs, leaving David alone in the suffocating silence of his own palace. Days pass, and his sickness falls upon the child born of David's illicit affair. David fasts and prays, weeping on the floor, begging for the infant's life to be spared. Servants whisper in the corridors, fearing the king's erratic behavior and his deep despair. The child breathes his last, and the palace is filled with the sound of mourning. David rises from the floor, washes his face, and changes his royal robes in silence. He enters the sanctuary, bowing his head in submission to the divine will of God. Outside, the kingdom begins to stir with whispers of the king's moral failure. Internal strife takes root among David's sons, fueled by the king's loss of authority. Amnon looks at his siblings with growing resentment, mirroring the darkness of his father. Absalom watches from the shadows, his heart turning toward rebellion and cold, calculated ambition. The unity of the kingdom fractures, as if the foundation of the palace is cracking. David walks the balcony again, but the view no longer brings him pride or peace. He sees the horizon, knowing that the peace he once enjoyed is now gone forever. His children argue in the courtyard, their voices rising in anger and bitter, sharp discord. David reaches out a hand, but he cannot stop the tide of his family's destruction. The legacy he built is tarnished, stained by the blood of the loyal soldier Uriah. He realizes that mercy does not erase the consequences of his choices and actions. The sword of conflict begins to sharpen, ready to strike at the heart of Israel. David sits in the dark, reflecting on the price of his singular, unchecked desire. He is a king, yet he is a prisoner to the memories of his past. The palace walls seem to close in on him, reflecting his own internal moral decay. He prays for his children, but his words feel hollow against the rising tide. Betrayal lurks in the corners of his home, waiting for the right moment to strike. David watches his son Absalom sharpen a blade, a chilling omen of the future. The king's power remains, but his influence over his own household has completely vanished. He understands now that moral accountability is a weight no king can ever escape. The sun sets over Jerusalem, casting long, dark shadows across the king's weary face. He bows his head, accepting the long, difficult road of penance that lies ahead. The story of his life is now a warning to all who hold great power. Desire was his undoing, and regret is the only companion he has left now. He stands alone, a broken man in the center of a crumbling, fractured royal legacy. The palace lights flicker and dim, mirroring the fading glory of his once great reign. David closes his eyes, bracing for the storm that he knows is finally coming.